Sales conversations where both buyers and sellers win are rare and plagued by the cringe. We've all felt it. It's that sinking feeling that both buyer and seller get when the conversation is going off the rails. My name is Adam Clay. I'm the CEO of Rainmakers. I've spent 25 years building and leading global sales organizations and thinking about the sales conversation. At the Cringe, we put the sales conversation under the microscope and explore pathways to ensuring that sales reps, leaders, and managers conduct great sales conversations. Today, my guest is Steve Craner, founder and owner of Software Sales Gurus. Steve, welcome to the show.
Hey, Adam. It's great to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, so am I. We're just thrilled to have you here. So tell us a little bit about Software Sales Gurus and the kind of sales conversations that you help organizations master.
So I think one of the important things to understand about me as we get into our conversation, this will become extremely evident. I am not a natural salesperson. I was trained in the Army. The Army paid my way through college, so my training is military and it is engineering. In those days, I was an airborne ranger. These days, I'm more of a PowerPoint ranger. And my perspective on sales conversations comes from kind of the Army habit of doing a thing and then stopping and doing an after-action review of the thing you just did so that you close the cybernetic loop and always try to make it a little bit better. I mean, if I threw a party, we did an after-action report. Obviously, if you were in a combat operation or an airborne operation, you would do an after-action report. The Air Force does the same thing. They pull the black boxes and they do a rankless review of what just happened. And through that continuous inspection of the process, hopefully you're advancing the knowledge of the warfighters and what's actually working. So that's what I tend to do with sales calls. I record the calls and I'm doing sales tests. I don't think there's too many people on the planet doing this way. It's a kind of a geeky engineering military way of approaching things, but that's what I do. So my perspective on sales conversations comes from listening to a lot of call recordings for the purpose of coaching and also split testing what works in sales conversations so you can determine what really does and doesn't work at the interface of the buyer and the seller.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Steve. So I want to share a fact with listeners. Now, you and I have worked together for, at this point, the better part of 15 years. And I know something that people who haven't met you before don't know, but I think it's important to get on the table at the start of the conversation here. I would contend that you've listened to more hours of recorded sales calls than any other human on the planet. And my belief from earlier conversations is that it amounts to more than 10,000 hours of calls. Do I have that right?
Yeah, you do. I just left a mastery call session, having reviewed calls and reviewing calls with a new client that I'm working with. So that's what I do day in, day out. And at this point, having done it for 30 years, certainly over 10,000 hours.
All right. And so I have to ask, it's generally the first big question on the show. When you hear sales calls, and you've heard a lot of sales calls, what makes you cringe?
As people are learning something new, especially folks who already have a way of going about it, who are kind of having to redo their swing. I remember Tiger Woods when he redid his swing after his first full year of professional golfing. It was a rather painful process, and it is the same way for our sales folks. So what you hear is how strong our tendencies are. We have DNA, we have a nature, we have old learning, and under a little duress, just the duress of being in a conversation with another person, we tend to revert to our instincts. So you hear people doing that, and you also hear them overcoming that and maybe doing something that's new and uncomfortable. And, you know, in some cases, I'm a little uncomfortable asking this question, and therefore I make the buyer a little uncomfortable answering the question. And that's the point at which many people will say, oh my gosh, that was a cringy moment. that new stuff didn't work and they do what I call reverting, they blame the new stuff, or they say it's not going to work for me or in my industry, and they just revert to their old habits and they never get any better. So trying new things is oftentimes a point where I call it a good cringe. I mean, you don't want that to happen, but you have to have that happen. If you're going to try new things, it's going to happen once in a while. You have to take a little risk. And if you never do that, if you avoid the cringe by not doing new things, you're never going to continue growing and learning and getting better.
See, I knew that you'd have a nuanced understanding of the cringe. And so tell us a little bit about what you teach sellers to do in a call that makes the conversations they then have unique and different from what they were doing before or what the mass of salespeople would typically do.
So the call we were just on, one of the light bulbs, I like people to record their calls, listen to their own calls, make their own judgments before they ever see my notes or hear my ideas, because they'll come to the same conclusions. Once they're a third party to the event and they're listening to other call recordings, they pick up on the very things I want them to learn, and I don't have to teach them. You know, like Churchill said, I love to learn, but I hate to be taught. Nobody likes to be taught, right? And one of the light bulbs that just came out of a session I just finished was this idea that our customers want a presentation or a demo in the software world, and they're asking for it, and therefore I can't really do this diagnostic thing or this discovery thing because I need to add value by giving a presentation. Now, we've got somebody who is asking me, Steve, when they really want a presentation, what am I going to do? When you play back the tape and listen to it, what do you hear? The man never asked for a presentation. And I didn't say this, she said this, I guess I heard it in my own head. He did not ask for a presentation. She thought she heard him ask for a presentation and flipped into a presentation instead of doing a proper diagnosis prior to the presentation. And that whole thing obviously is heading in the wrong direction for everybody.
So one example is premature presentation. And I think your point is it's occasionally, at least in this example, imagined by the seller. What's another example, Steve, of behavior that salespeople carry into conversations that you're there to correct?
We're impatient. We want to be the one that's talking, and we want to be in control. So at the very beginning of the perfect diagnostic conversation, one of the things I suggest we do is we simply ask the buyer, what are our goals for this conversation? Not what keeps you awake at night or why'd you take this meeting? Those things, if you think of a horse in a steeplechase, they balk at going, or they don't want to go over the next hurdle. Buyers do the same thing. If you ask somebody to be vulnerable too quickly, it just causes them to shut down. You're creating a threatening environment, not a safe environment. And instead, you ask a safer question. What are your goals for this conversation? And then the discipline of saying, okay, A and B, is there anything else? Just to get folks to do that, I call it unpacking the truck. To get every package out of that truck so you know everything they want to get done in this meeting so that we have a complete mutual agenda and there are no hidden agenda items is something that people find takes them a couple of reps, a couple of weeks, just to be patient enough to do that and to believe it's even going to work, as opposed to somehow blowing up in their face like a Takata airbag.
I get that reference. So I want to return in a moment to other examples, because the first two that you gave, I think, are so interesting and relevant and common. But let's double click on that second one. So just the mere act of asking the buyer what they want to accomplish in the call and asking again, is there anything more that you want to accomplish? So there's a clear plan or roadmap for the conversation. You're saying on the 10,000 hours of film that you've listened to, sales call recordings, you don't hear that very often. Now, why is that? I've always wondered why salespeople, of course I did it when I was young, I have my own explanation, Why do salespeople feel the need to own the plan for the meeting without deference to the buyer's objectives and goals? Where does that come from?
I think human psychology indicates that we all just want to be safe. And, if you're in an emergency, somebody's shooting at you or there's a fire, we all understand that's a risky situation. But what we don't realize is we also fear harm to our emotional well-being. We fear being embarrassed. Remember that old story about the thing that people feared most, and it was public speaking. This is from, I think, the 1919 or something like that. And it wasn't a multiple choice thing. It was a write-in thing. So people wrote in, I'm afraid of public speaking. So I think salespeople do much of what they do, the same reason all humans do all things they do, to guard our self-esteem and to protect ourselves. And one of the things in a conversation that makes us feel safe is if we're the one that's talking, then nothing bad really can happen, or we imagine that. If we give the other party a little control over what's going on, all of a sudden we're like, oh my gosh, now I'm skating on thin ice. What if they do this? What if they do that? What if it goes in a way that I can't anticipate? I feel unsafe. So I think it's about fearing harm to our psychological well-being versus having that emotional resilience that soldiers and firefighters and salespeople also have to have.
So I think, Steve, that's a reference to a book that you introduced me to years ago called Leadership in Dangerous Situations, that posits, among many things, people feel emotional harm. They feel the risk of emotional harm more deeply, more seriously than they do even the risk of physical harm, which is to say that people would rather jump off a cliff into a body of water 30 feet below than take their hands off the wheel in a sales meeting or get up in front of a group and have a conversation. Do I have that right?
Yeah, people, not everybody's going to say this, but somebody just said it to me today. I'd rather jump out of an airplane than make the cold call.
There you go. There you go. Because the risk of emotional harm is feared more in many instances than even physical harm.
Yeah, I think that's a big, I was introduced to that leadership study from our last 10, 15 years of combat through the leadership program up at West Point, the Leadership in Dangerous Situations. And it clicked to me as we're talking about this, leading soldiers and first responders is different than leading accountants and engineers. But the other thing is, yes, we fear harm to our psychological well-being as much as, or even more than physical harm. So all of a sudden, leadership in dangerous situations, leadership approaches apply to leading salespeople. Leading salespeople is more like coaching athletes, leading soldiers, leading first responders than it is managing a group of accountants or engineers or other functional areas.
I've heard it said before that a sales call isn't a great place to have your emotional needs met. And that being said, and just to bring the idea that you're putting on the table home for everybody who's listening, what are the sort of things that a seller might fear doing in a sales call that are actually good for the buyer and are good for the outcome that they won't do?
We like to fly by the seat of our pants. If you see my guitar in the background there, if I'm going to play a song, it's better that I practice in private and then play it in front of folks. If I've practiced it in the house and my wife is hearing me practicing it for a couple of weeks and then I play it, it's not enjoyable to her. If I go practice in private somewhere and then I play the song once I've kind of got it down, she says, "Oh, what is that? That's new. That's beautiful. That's wonderful." So salespeople tend to resist preparation and structure as if it's beneath our dignity. So we get on calls and we're winging it all the time. We're improvising all of our questions. If you think about comedians, switching away from first responders for a moment, comedians don't just take all their new jokes and then take them to some big stage. Chris Rock goes to little clubs in New York and tries his material out in small audiences. The reason they do that is because if I write 20 jokes, 19 of them, I think all 20 of them are funny, but 19 of them are going to not make it in front of an audience, and one is good. And therefore, my routine needs to be made up of that 1 out of 20 jokes that I've proven is actually good. Salespeople aren't like comedians. We don't do that level of preparation, and they resist structure and discipline. So when it comes to really understanding some problem or pain that somebody just put on the table, we're a little shy to ask the 10 questions of what I call the need diagnostic to really drill down into that, because we don't like structure, and also we're a little afraid that we're going to be so intrusive that it's going to make the other party uncomfortable.
So afraid of structure, afraid of being intrusive. You're suggesting that doing those things sort of breaks patterns that salespeople, according to conventional wisdom, bring into a conversation. But isn't there something more? And this is a bit of a leading question, because I know you have strong opinions on this. Isn't the act of asking questions often fearful to a sales rep because they're afraid that they're going to hear no, because they're afraid that the buyer is going to say something to disrupt their sale or kill their deal? And it's a little more comfortable to carry a kernel of hope into the forecast than it is to say this is no longer an opportunity. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and I think it's we fear harms our psychological well-being, so it's not intellectually difficult. At the very front of a perfect discovery call, I ask people to invite customers to say no. Right up front, in the first minute of a sales call, I'm saying, by the way, at some point you might understand that we're not a fit. I'm a salesperson. I have a thick skin. It'd be good for both of us. Would you tell me no if you're thinking no? When you go to implement that in the real world, it's not intellectually difficult to understand that, or even to understand why you might do it. But salespeople have great difficulty actually doing that because you're inviting someone to say no to you. And the reason it's important, of course, is if you truly convince them that it's no big deal to say no, sales conversations, this is why I love the idea that you call this the cringe. Sales conversations occur on the cusp of human behavior. They are not like other conversations. Buyers and sellers both come in with this fear of conflict, which we deeply fear. Humans fear conflict. Dogs fear conflict. Cats don't fear conflict. Why? We're a species that lives in social groups. We avoid conflict. Same with dogs. Therefore, if we deal with that right up front and set a context that says it's okay to say no to me, I can take it gracefully, it's not going to hurt my feelings. Now it's set a context that is very constructive for a conversation, and in the end, they feel more comfortable talking to me and will open up to me more because I actually have convinced them that I can take it. For most salespeople, the idea of allowing people to say no it's like, putting a stake through your own heart.
And so let's take that and return to what we were talking about earlier, which was examples of things that you hear in the thousands of hours of conversations that you've heard. I'm going to load this next question up and relate it to what you just said, because I think what you're talking about, and I learned this from you, Steve, is that it's important to disarm the conversation. Just disarm the buyer by letting them know that no is okay, that you're comfortable if you get to the end of the conversation and there's nothing more to be done, that it's fine to use the old Sandler aphorism to part ways as friends. But there's a reason that's effective, and it has to do with disarming some of the defense that buyers put up when they come into a sales conversation. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Right. We both come in realizing we're on the cusp of conflict. And if we will, there was two elements of what I was suggesting there at the beginning of the call. One, we're saying it's okay to say no to me. So that makes them feel like there's less conflict inherent in the conversation as you move forward. And the other piece is, when I say I'm a salesperson, I have a thick skin, I can take it, I am being self-deprecating. And in doing that, if you want to be the most appealing version of yourself, if you want to be a person that is liked and trusted, if you're a little self-deprecating, it immediately establishes what people refer to as rapport or likability or trust in a way that all attempts at building social rapport, et cetera, tend to backfire because on sales calls, those are seen as contrived. Although I don't know that I'm actually getting to the point you were thinking about. That's the two elements that come to mind there. Make it okay to say no and make it a little fun of yourself in the process so that they really, in their viscerally, feel comfortable with you.
So it's so interesting to hear you talk about these things because it strikes me how in day-to-day social settings, the sort of things that you're describing get done amongst friends. They get done amongst partners and family. We say things like, hey, I don't expect you to agree with me, right? Like I wouldn't expect us to have the same opinion, but I'm interested in hearing your point of view. These are things that we say in conversations in our daily lives that just aren't brought by default to a sales conversation. I find that to be one of the central ironies in a sales conversation is that we make these departures from basic human conversational behavior the minute as salespeople we're in front of a buyer. Why is that?
Boy, that is so true. If you have a conversation with somebody in a sales scenario and then you sit down with that same person and have a beer with them, it's like you're talking to two completely different people. It's like we put on this sales uniform and this sales mentality when we go into sales conversations and we morph into a different kind of human being. Why is that? I mean, one of the coaching cues you can give to sales folks is just language drives behavior. And I think when you call somebody a salesperson and they say, now I am a salesperson, they have this stereotype of what a salesperson is and what they do. So they just morph into that. I don't like to refer to selling as qualifying, for instance. I know qualification is something people probably won't buy into that idea, but I like to refer to it not as qualification, because when I'm qualifying somebody, it's something I'm doing for my interest and I'm doing it to them. If we refer to the conversation not as a presentation, not as a qualification call, but as a diagnostic conversation, that will drive good behavior. If we refer to it as a sales conversation, I'm morphing to that salesperson. I'm presenting, I'm handling stalls and objections. If I refer to it as a diagnostic conversation and I see myself as a diagnostician, then all of a sudden I start acting like a doctor or maybe a therapist, or I start modeling that behavior. So I think the root of it is that language is incredibly important. And when we use certain language, it drives certain behavior. As I moved away from the old Sandler world you just referred to and wanted to update the material, which is one of the reasons I had to move away, I updated all the language. So if I said we're about to build a mutual agenda, I could say that directly to a customer. If we're about to build a mutual action plan, I could say that to a customer. If I say to a customer, I'm about to strip line, or I'm going to rationally drown you, or I'm going to qualify you, that language is all negative. You can't say that to customers. So make the language something you could say directly to customers. Therefore, it drives right and mutual behavior.
I love that. And it was on my list of things to talk about today, and I want to return to that in a moment. I want to circle back to something you just said as it relates to examples of things that you were giving as to what an effective salesperson could do. And I know from work that we've done in the past that you're upfront with this point. So implicit with what you're saying is the fact that saying I'm a salesperson, I have thick skin, or in work that you and I have done around the cold call, saying this is a sales call, putting that on the table without any shame, without any desire to hide that fact is a big part, I think, of the core belief system that you try to help sellers establish. So I want to come back to other points of language, but there's this central thing that I also learned from you about just saying I'm a salesperson. This is a sales conversation. Like, I'm here to see if there's reason for us to even continue a conversation. Talk a little bit about why that's so important and why people avoid saying that.
Address the elephant in the room. If you remember, I don't know if you ever saw him do this. I may be making a reference you're not familiar with, but remember my friend and partner Ganesh, who would walk in with a turban on. Now he's a Sikh, but this is, during the time of 9/11 and post 9/11. So the elephant in the room is here's this man standing in front of you with a turban and a full beard, and he would address the elephant in the room immediately. He would say, this is not the most popular look today, so let me explain. And then he would make some little joke about why he had a turban on. I had a hand injury in the 60s or something. So just refreshing, disarming honesty in the face of dealing with the elephant in the room is just like a breath of fresh air. And the idea of just being really direct and honest about this is a cold call. Are you sure you don't want to hang up? Is one of those moments that people cringe thinking about doing it. They cringe as they do it. They don't want to do it. They refuse to do it. But that cringing is all occurring in the salesperson. If you listen to the call recordings and how buyers across the world at all levels and all cultures respond, that refreshing, clean spring air that all of a sudden just blows by, and they laugh out loud and they appreciate that disarming honesty and just, addressing the elephant in the room.
So in the spirit of examples of things that you have heard in thousands of hours of sales conversations, if a salesperson is not saying, hey, this is a cold call, are you sure you don't want to hang up? And if they're not saying, I'm a salesperson, I've got thick skin, if the answer is no, that's fine. What are they saying instead?
And most sales folks are very quickly reaching for that PowerPoint and just marching through the slides in order, not necessarily so much on cold calls and prospecting calls, but on discovery calls. They're going to that very quickly. As we said earlier, nobody asked for a presentation, but they imagine somebody asked for a presentation. And that's like our life preserver. We grab it real quick. And that's kind of like a paratrooper who jumps out of a plane, has a full canopy, and then reaches for the reserve and pulls it and deploys it too. Now I got two chutes that are caught up, and now I got a problem. Only use it if you need it. So they go to that too quick, and they're just marching through the corporate PowerPoint because that feels safe. And what you hear as they're doing it is, if they actually did a little two-way dialogue and set a nice mutual agenda and got started on a diagnostic call, you had a very engaged, enthusiastic customer, and the PowerPoint is just like throwing water, a wet blanket on a fire, and all of a sudden you ask them a question. They're non-responsive. Their videos go off on the Zoom. They're multitasking. They're not listening. And when you're going through your points, you're talking to them about typical people and typical problems. You're not talking to them about them and the thing they just said to you. And you're even doing it in kind of a bored sing-song kind of voice because you've said it so many times that you don't even sound like you're listening to yourself, and they certainly are. So that's the most common thing I see and that we have to fix. We got to get away from the corporate pitch and the harbor toward demos and get into diagnostic mode and really address this person about their circumstances.
So that being said, I know that you're a firm believer in something that's very simple in a sales call, harder to master because it runs against some of the conventional wisdom that sellers carry into conversations, beliefs about what their role is. But that is establishing the right to ask questions. And so establishing the right to ask questions, the reason why I'm going to ask questions, it's very often overlooked. I find that it has a magical property in a sales conversation because it helps the buyer understand why you're about to ask them questions, why it's important for you to understand a little bit more about the current situation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. By the way, I mentioned my engineering and military background. There are 9 principles of warfare, and one of them is to seize and to maintain the initiative, to be on the offensive, to seize and maintain the initiative. Now, we're not in warfare, and we're not trying to hurt anybody here, but that applies, that strategy applies in business and in conversations and in games too. So if you think about it, who has the initiative? Who's leading the conversation? The person who's asking the questions or the person who's answering the questions? The person who's asking the questions has the initiative, has conversational control. And that's important for you to have conversational control. If you communicate to them, you're going to do it. And the reason you're going to do it is to get a deeper understanding of them and their personal world. Buyers agree to that. And they prefer that greatly to presentations and Harvard tour demos, so they don't fight with it. And you've also reset expectations because they may come into the conversation thinking you're like every other salesperson, and therefore you're going to do a presentation. So they understand now you're asking questions. They understand why. They say, so you'd like to lead this dance? Fine, lead the dance. And now everybody's comfortable with that. If we fail to do that, then we may have an expectation in their mind that is different than what's happening. And at some point they're like, why is this person asking me so many questions?
That's right.
There was 2 Harvard PhDs that did a thing in Harvard Business Review called The Surprising Power of Questions. And they were reporting their various research they've done over the years. It was, I don't know, Harvard Business Review 2018, something like that, The Surprising Power of Questions. And one of the things they talked about is properly framing questions. And what we're talking about here is framing. Why is it we're asking the questions, making sure they're okay with it so they're a willing participant, and now it's a comfortable thing to do.
And so setting the stage for why it's important to ask questions, critical, often overlooked, possibly because sellers are afraid the buyer's going to say, well, no, I don't want you to ask me any questions. Correct? But you don't hear that on film. That doesn't happen.
There's a set of seller beliefs and a set of buyer beliefs, and they are not the same. And listening to game film is the only thing that forces salespeople to stop believing the things they currently believe that simply are not true in the real world. And yes, they do have that fear that, well, I'm adding value by giving a presentation and showing how smart I am. A sales call is not a good place to be smart. It's smart. And that's
I like that.
Opposite of what most people are comfortable doing.
I like that. All right. So now we're in the part of the conversation where you're going to ask questions. And I know that you have some thoughts on how to ask questions, from language to be used, language to be avoided, tonality to adopt, and tonality to avoid. Can you speak, Steve, for a couple of minutes about what you've learned in terms of what's effective?
Yeah, you only get this by listening to call recordings or being a third party to the event. How you say what you say, your tone or your vocal persona, is vastly and more important than what you say. And it'd be great if both were really optimized. So for instance, if you just said to me, Steve, I have problem XYZ, I might say, well, how long's that been going on? Or I might say, how long has that been going on? Same exact words, 2 completely different emotional impacts on the other party. Another great example is as folks are conducting a good need diagnostic and they're getting deeper beyond symptoms to root causes, to impact, to financial impact, and asking those tough questions, they know what they're trying to do is uncover a pain or a problem, or maybe something on the positive side, a goal, something somebody wants to achieve. But especially if it's a pain or a problem, I hear this. The buyer will say, well, the fact is we really have this problem, and now they're really opening up to you because you've created this environment where they're okay being vulnerable, and they're at a new deep level of vulnerability. And then you, having heard the pain they just expressed, say, oh, that's good to hear. You see why I'm smiling now? We hear that all the time. So as they're expressing their pain, we're happy about it because we as a salesperson know that was our goal, and we just achieved our goal. Obviously not the right thing to do. We can go the other way. We could be empathetic. It's like a really big problem. We see a lot of people who suffer from that. The problem with being empathetic is that can quickly be patronizing and not empathetic at all. So and I think I get this word actually from you, that middle ground in terms of tone, as you're deep in asking somebody to be vulnerable and you're asking difficult questions, is to have practiced indifference, to say things like, understood. Is there more about that you think I need to understand? Just almost like a therapist in the middle, not being patronizing, not being happy in the face of their trouble, but just to be kind of out of the picture and let them tell the story.
So let me tie that to something that I've encountered, that I'm sure you've encountered when trying to change the way sales conversations happen in an organization. There's a whole population of people who will say, in response to the conversation that we're having right now, gee, Adam, Steve, I understand the logic behind the tonality that you're suggesting. I understand the logic behind the language that you're suggesting. The whole thing feels manipulative. And I've always thought that that was more of a defensive statement for people who are uncomfortable with doing the right things in the sales call than it was a useful statement. Because I think everything that you just said is, to bring it back to something we talked about earlier in the conversation, it's just grounded in good human behavior and conversation. It's just adopting a belief that in a sales call, you're talking to another human, and it is good to be empathetic. It is good to want to understand a little bit more about the other person's point of view. And I always find it ironic that people, generally naysayers, refer to some of these things that we're talking about now as manipulative. Now, where do you think that comes from, Steve?
I think oftentimes the sales methodologies themselves, and kind of referring back to the idea of the language, my old mentor, David Sandler, when he's talking about this idea of pulling left, or what he referred to as a strip line, there's a little quiz in the workbook as you were getting the initial training about that. And the question was, how will the prospect feel if you get good at stripping line? And the answer that you had to write in the book to get the right answer was, like his underwear is around his ankles. So it comes from the ethical underpinning. If we don't think about an ethical underpinning and don't state it and don't have that as a primary central piece of our sales methodology, then it's kind of happenstance. If we do like he did, and actually his philosophy stated was, salespeople get lied to by buyers all the time, so you could lie to them, and you should lie to them. That's one of the things that I absolutely had to fix as a West Pointer. I said to Sandler, look, I don't lie, I don't cheat, I don't steal, and I don't really particularly tolerate people who do. That's why I came up with a different way of prospecting than the pretense call that he had come up with. When you have a negative ethical underpinning, that's going to flow through everything. And I think that's an extreme but true example. When you use terms like rational drowning or qualification, that still is is something you're doing to somebody. It's not of mutual benefit. So one of the basic starting points of any properly constructed sales methodology should be an ethical basis, which says everything we do is to seek and achieve mutual advantage, like we would do with our brothers and sisters, versus all this whole body of really manipulative stuff that you do to people, which is most of sales training and most of sales methodologies. It comes from the fact that it actually does have a negative ethical underpinning, something you're doing to somebody, or it's not a stated ethical underpinning, so there's no place to come back and root it. If, as part of preparation for the perfect discovery call, one of the things I ask people to do is to come up with the 30 questions you're going to ask in the perfect discovery call. And as you think about each one, think about, why is it I would be doing the buyer a disservice if I didn't ask this question? And in that process, what you're doing is making sure that your belief system is supporting the asking of each of these questions. if you believe it's an important question and there's a mutual benefit to it, even if it's a difficult question, you will be able to ask it and ask it in a way in which you are comfortable, and you will optimize the chance you will make them comfortable responding to. If you don't know why you're asking, if you're asking because your boss told you to, if you're asking because you want to make sure their underwear is around their ankle, be extremely powerful. It's going to blow up in your face a lot too.
So it's so interesting that you say that, because in this era of social media and short attention spans, there has been, at least I've perceived this, in the last 5 years, and I think it's accelerated dramatically in the last couple of years, just an explosion of short clips from people who are professing to be sales experts, and they very well might be. This is the irony of just conveying sales tips and sales tricks. And in a vacuum, a lot of it does strike me as manipulative. And the risk, that as a seller, if I'm getting my sales training from just a feed, a constant feed of isolated tips and tricks, it's difficult, particularly in this day and age, to take a step back and say, am I actually doing the right thing here for the buyer, from me, from my company? Am I proceeding with integrity? But it requires the seller to just stop and say, hey, is this right to do? Is this correct to do? Can I get behind this? And I think the work that you and others do by placing some of the things that we're talking about into, formal frameworks, formal methods, structured conversations, belief systems, changes in behavior, help people understand that there is a very solid ethical footing here. But if all anybody ever heard from this conversation were 15-second snippets of tips and tricks, that would probably be missed. And I think the whole thing begins to sound like manipulation of the buyer.
And a bunch of disassociated insights, as opposed to a whole process that makes sense and that is rooted in ethical underpinning of mutuality and doing things with people. You're so right about that. This old military saying that slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Just doing things quickly isn't efficient. As a matter of fact, many times it is inefficient. Again, this is probably some of you'll cut from the tape, but I suggest a good, perfect diagnostic call takes an hour. You can't get it done in 15 or 30 minutes. And, if you think about colonoscopies, if you had a choice between 4 15-minute colonoscopies or 1 hour colonoscopy, they got the job done. Which would you choose? At some point, we need to take the full hour, do the whole job, do it once, one and done, and not you keep doing parts of it and never get us there. That's going to have all sorts of bad effects on both the buyer and the seller. By the way, the other thing that you said, where does this come from? The other place it comes from is management pressure that is only management pressure on outcomes. You're going to think this is a ridiculous example, but it comes from game film. And the guy who did this is an extremely smart medical doctor who happened to be in a sales role in this particular case. So he's not a dummy. He's a smart guy. What he's saying on the game film to the buyer is, we just got a new sales VP. He says, our forecast isn't accurate, so I need to know, when is this going to happen? Well, that's a cringy moment.
The cringiest.
Right. And like I said, this guy's not a dummy. He's under pressure from his boss to make the forecast more accurate. And the boss didn't say, here's how you make a forecast more accurate. He just said, make it more. And so that pressure just translated directly to the customer. That's a cause of a lot of bad behavior. Managers managing to outcomes, as opposed to, like Degas, who painted that painting back there, who said about the ballerina and about painting, it takes great effort to make it look effortless. If we want our salespeople to do something and they don't know how, we have to take the time to teach them. And for that ballerina to get to do what she did back there, she's got years under her belt Salespeople need that same thing. Behind great performance is great process mastered.
Right. With practice and a lot of practice. Well said. All right, Steve, thank you. So let's shift gears into something that's become a hallmark of the show. It's typically the last thing that we do, and that is a role play. And you and I spoke before we started to broadcast about maybe doing 2 role plays of the same conversation with differences in tonality and word choice. And so, tell us what you want to role play.
Let's do a need diagnostic. That tends to be a place where there's a lot of cringiness. So we've already done that mutual agenda thing. You've put some sort of a need on the table, and now we're exploring that need. By the way, when you do role plays fail because buyers don't have real needs in role plays. I'm doing this because you just told me to role play it. So as you construct role plays, it's important that the buyer have a need. So if you would, think of a persona that you've played. You know, the one I've listened to, I've heard your game film. I remember a call you made on an insurance company, for instance, where we actually talked about the questions ahead of time, then you did it, and you did it masterfully. So play that person, play somebody, but if you would, start with a need, and then I'll just kind of develop it a little bit, and we can see how it could go well or how it could do poorly, if you don't mind doing it.
I don't mind. So we could take it back a little bit. I'll be a chief security officer for a software company, and I'm worried about breach of our systems. Sound good?
Breach, yes. Let's go there. Adam, obviously I don't understand you and your world, and I don't know if we'll be a fit. Could you tell me a little bit more about what breaches look like in your environment?
Yeah, well, given the sensitivity of the customer data that we hold in our infrastructure, breaches are catastrophic. And about a year ago, we were hit with one. You probably read about it on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And we're taking all measures to avoid that ever happening again.
Are there more details that perhaps weren't so public that you think I should understand?
Yeah, well, there are. I know that we've put an NDA in place, so if you haven't heard it before, you'll hear it from me. The breach was a function of a missed configuration, a very basic setting that could have been made in one of our environments that wasn't, and it was exploited without much effort by the bad guys.
So we all understand that example because it was in the papers. Of course, I read that before our conversation, but it sounds like there's a lot more to that instance that wasn't in the papers. Without going too far, is there more about that particular instance? What happened that day that might be important to understand?
Yeah. So the setting was missed because we had recently upgraded some of the underlying software in that system, and there was a reset to defaults. And it would appear that the bad guys recognized that and took advantage of it. It was really unfortunate.
So how long has that been going on?
Well, we've been living in fear of it happening again. Granted, we've been taking a lot of steps to make sure that it doesn't for the better part of a year since that event transpired.
Well, I'm sure we can help you with that. Let me tell you how. Now, I intentionally at that point did part A of our little split test there. If we could just jump back to how long has that been going on, this would be a second version. Instead of saying, how long's that been going on, which I was trying to portray as a kind of an accusatory thing that makes you feel uncomfortable answering. You did answer, thank you. Instead, tonality-wise, I probably should say something like, so how long has that been on your radar? I've changed the words, so it's not accusatory. And also the biggest change there is the change in the tonality. How long has that been on your radar? Is that just an anomaly, or is that something that happens more frequently? Just be a little more gentle about the conversation, and certainly not jump into the presentation.
Yeah, right. Jumping into the presentation, a great counterexample. A temptation now that a lot of pain's been put on the table by the buyer, just to fast forward into how you can help.
Right. We think we see the problem, so we start saying, here's how we're going to solve the problem. there's still a ways to go. And if you want to jump back in the role play, I'll go back to how long has it been on your radar?
Yeah, for the better part of a year.
So in that year, what kind of things have you tried to ameliorate that?
Well, just about everything. And I don't want to go too far because it's going to require me to talk a little bit about the specific systems and process and tools that we've implemented, but about everything that you could imagine.
Gotcha. So I certainly want to press that right now. At some point, we will need to understand that in greater detail to understand how we would fit in the environment. But let me ask this. Through those efforts, I heard you say sprawl. Do you feel like you have pretty much resolved it, or have you made significant progress?
I think we've made progress. I'm not convinced that we've resolved it at all, particularly as the nature of threats that organizations like ours from a cybersecurity perspective continue to evolve.
So let's get out of those technical weeds for a minute and step back to the big picture. If we think of your company like a car, is what we're talking about, the updates leading to the breaches, is that like a car with an engine that won't turn over? So in other words, it can do its basic job. It's a really big deal to your company. Or is it more on the other end of the spectrum where it's like a little ding on the bumper? It's mostly cosmetic and not that big a deal.
No, this is an engine problem, if not bigger.
Gotcha. So to translate that into financial impact, I need your help because everybody in your industry approaches cost-benefit analysis in slightly different ways. You haven't mentioned any financial impact. Is that because in this case and in most cases there was none?
Well, no. To the contrary, there has been. You can read about it in the newspapers. Perhaps you have. We were slapped with all manner of suits. We had to spend a substantial amount of money in our defense, to say nothing of the tools that we put in place, and of course, the underwriters for our cyber insurance policies just took advantage of the fact that we had this breach and put our premiums through the roof. So there's been an unheralded cost here.
Yeah, I am aware of what the press says, and I'm always a little careful about believing whether they got it all right. It sounds like there were some things you just mentioned the work in the press. All told, if you were to add that all up, roughly order of magnitude, what was the overall cost?
Millions and millions, Steve. I don't have an exact figure, but it was significant.
Gotcha. So, I know you've got a lot of important things on your plate, probably hundreds of things you have to deal with on a daily basis. In your stack of things that you have to worry about, where is this one? Towards the top 2 or 3 that's actually going to get your immediate attention, or realistically further down the list?
Yeah, it's right on top. We move very quickly to implement different processes and systems and tools, as I've mentioned. And I'm still concerned about sprawl and complexity in our security fabric, and I just got to get that addressed.
Gotcha. And for the most part, I think you probably made this clear, but to make sure I do understand why you prioritize it so high, is there anything else about the why it's on the top of the list?
Well, it's me and my livelihood. I'm the chief security officer at this company, and I'm personally on the hook to ensuring this doesn't happen again.
Gotcha. So we'll stop the role play there just to go from the top to the bottom of a need diagnostic, and to do that twice so you can see it kind of going south. Truncated early, jumping into a presentation is a really typical thing. To the way we ask the questions can truncate the process because we get accusatory, or we make somebody feel uncomfortable instead of making them feel comfortable getting uncomfortable enough to actually have that urgency that's needed. And the other thing I would point out in terms of cringe, there is good cringe on the part of the people you're talking to, the buyers. As a matter of fact, it's necessary, mandatory cringe. I did a call, and I record most of my actual sales calls. Real call, real sales VP. The guy is a cage fighter as well as a sales VP. Serially successful sales VP. He's a man's man. And walked through this same thing, got to the point where he was uncomfortable admitting to the personal, emotional stuff. And he said, one of the top reasons that I think I really need somebody like you to come in is because I don't think I personally have a lot of strong skills, but me training my people is not one of my top skills. So he's admitting to a shortcoming about himself. And then if you listen to the whole recording, we're done. We've wrapped up. The guy that had introduced me to him was on the call as a third party the whole time, but didn't actually speak. At the very end, there's like an outtake where he said, I said, so I hope I didn't embarrass you. How did that go? He said, I can't believe he put up with all that, because it clearly got to a point where the buyer was uncomfortable. And I'm suggesting to you that your job as a salesperson is to keep them as comfortable as you can, protect their self-esteem as they get to that point of convincing you this is a personal, emotional need that's important to me and is going to energize my action, or it's not. You're detached. You don't care which way it goes, but that's where you got to go. So the buyer has to get uncomfortable, because it is only discomfort that drives that little part of our frontal lobe that fires, that says, I'm deciding to take an action now. Pain is a necessary precursor to change in our species. And boy, it is really cringy for a salesperson to actually execute that, take it all the way to the bottom. But once you do, as the other party was uncomfortable at points, that discomfort was necessary, but you've also formed a bond so that you now are closer to them and a trusted advisor to them in a way that nobody else on the planet is, because you got past all the protective layers to the real truth. Now you understand the real truth. They know you understand it, and now you can actually do something about it.
Well, Steve, thank you for that. And I want to just call attention to something else that I observed in the role play, and that was a consistent tone from the first question to the last, of practiced indifference, even in the face of what a seller would perceive as overwhelming pain, therefore overwhelming opportunity. You maintained a neutral position. And I'll say this last thing, that when I've heard salespeople do as you've done, what you also hear on film, game tape, recordings, is the buyer saying, that was great. Thank you. Like, I'm so glad you asked those questions. That was a really good meeting. Hey, Steve, enjoyed talking to you last week. I just want to say that was one of the best conversations I've ever had with a vendor. That stuff starts to show up. It's remarkable. Like, you survey customers and they say, we really liked this company's sales process. It felt like they were very interested in whether and how they could help us, first and foremost.
Absolutely true. You should be getting compliments. If you're making cold calls, you should be getting compliments about every fifth call on how you go about the call. They should be sending emails to your CEO saying, I'm a new client because of this guy and the way he made this call, or this girl, how about you made the call. When you're writing up those mutual action plans and sending them to customers. I remember an example from Salesforce when I first started working with them. A young lady sent a written mutual action plan over to the buyer, and the buyer said, this is amazing. You're an amazingly good salesperson. Here's specifically why. Thank you so much. If you're not getting compliments from your sales conversations about 20% of the time, then you're not where you could be. And the good news is that is actually achievable.
And again, that's not a hypothetical statement. You actually hear that on film when this stuff is done
On the
well.
recording. Yes.
On the recordings. All right. Wonderful. Well, Steve, thank you so much for joining us today on The Cringe. It's been a true pleasure having you on the show.
Likewise. By the way, if you ever want to do another one and hear a really good salesperson who's really good at being neutral, I still have recordings of you talking to that insurance guy. You're really good at that. So we can get away from the role play and play some tape if you like.
I like that. I like that. That would be pulling one out of the archives. Indeed, that could be fun. Well, Steve,
Yeah.
thank you so much. This has been a delightful conversation, and I've enjoyed every minute of it.
Likewise, my friend. See you, Adam.
If you've enjoyed listening, follow me, Adam Clay, on LinkedIn. I'm regularly sharing insight and tips on the art of sales and the sales conversation. This podcast is produced and presented by Rainmakers, where we believe the sales conversation is everything. Check us out online at rnmkrs.com.